Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The air in Camelot had a different texture when something was wrong. Merlin could feel it before he even opened his eyes. A heaviness, like an impending storm, pressed down on the ancient stone walls of the castle. He sat at his wooden desk, surrounded by books and scrolls, the faint glow of candles flickering against the dimness of dawn. The world outside was quiet, but the silence was deceptive. Merlin rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of age more than ever. In the stillness, a whisper echoed through his mind, an old voice, one he hadn't heard in decades. It chilled him to the core. He pushed back from the desk, his chair scraping the stone floor, and stood. His fingers tingled with the familiar pulse of magic. But today, something was off. His connection to the mystical forces that had guided him for so long felt tenuous, frayed like an old rope. He closed his eyes, searching the threads of time for a disturbance, and then it hit him. A memory, long buried, rose to the surface like a dark specter. A pact, an ancient contract he had made in his youth. A reckless, hungry for power, and blind to the consequences. The image of the pact's symbols glowed in his mind, and for a moment, he was back in the ancient grove where he'd signed it. The sigils were foreign, written in a language older than Camelot itself, etched into the stone with magic so powerful it had taken him years to understand. He had thought the pact was long forgotten, buried under centuries of his deeds and the victories he'd helped Arthur achieve. But now, the pact's power stirred again, awakened by something dark. Or someone. Morgana, Merlin whispered, his voice rough with the realization. She was behind this. Of course she was. Morgana had always been a step ahead, always probing the weaknesses in Camelot's defenses. But this time, she had gone deeper, into the very fabric of magic itself. And if she had found the pact, if she knew the broken bar, Merlin shuddered to think of the devastation she could unleash. His thoughts raced as he paced the room. There had to be a way to stop her. There was always a way. But first, he needed to understand what she had discovered and how much danger they were all in. Merlin grabbed his staff from the corner of the room and stepped into the hallway. The corridors of Camelot were still quiet, with only the faintest sound of distant footsteps from the guards patrolling outside the great hall. Arthur would still be sleeping at this hour, but there was no time to waste. Merlin had to act before it was too late. As he made his way through the castle, memories of the past crept into his mind, unbidden. He saw himself as a young man, standing in the grove of ancient trees where the pact had been forged. He had been so full of arrogance then, so sure that the magic would bend to his will. He hadn't understood the consequences. Not really. It was a mistake he had buried deep, along with the shame that came with it. And now, that mistake had returned to haunt him. The great doors of the castle's library loomed before him, and Merlin pushed them open with a wave of his hand. Inside, the scent of old parchment and ink filled the air, familiar and comforting. But comfort was a luxury he couldn't afford now. He moved quickly through the aisles of ancient tomes, searching for the one that held the answer. It didn't take long to find it. The book was thick, bound in leather that had darkened with age. Merlin traced his fingers over the title, The Forbidden Contracts of the Ancients. It was a text few dared to open, and for good reason. Inside were the details of pacts and bonds forged with beings from beyond this world, creatures whose motives were as mysterious as their powers. Merlin flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the old script until he found the passage he was looking for. His heart sank as the words confirmed his worst fears. The pact he had signed all those years ago wasn't just a simple contract for power. It was tied to something far greater, a force that existed beyond the realms of men, one that could reshape the very fabric of the world. And now, Morgana had found a way to awaken it. The sigils glowed faintly on the page as Merlin read the instructions for breaking the pact. It wasn't going to be easy. The bond was woven into his very being, tied to his life force in ways that no ordinary spell could sever. To break it, he would need to return to the Sorcia, to the very place where the pact had been made. The grove. He slammed the book shut, his mind racing. There was no time to lose. Morgana would be moving quickly, and if she fully awakened the power within the pact, Camelot would fall. Merlin turned and left the library, his pace quickening as he headed for the stables. He would need to make the journey alone. Yeah, this was his burden to bear, a mistake from his past that he had to face on his own. As he saddled his horse, the early morning light began to filter through the windows of the stable, casting long shadows on the ground. The kingdom was waking up, blissfully unaware of the danger that loomed over them all. With a final glance at the castle behind him, Merlin mounted his horse and set off toward the grove. The journey was a long one, but he knew the path well. It was a place he had avoided for years, a place where his youthful arrogance had led him to make a decision that now threatened everything he had worked to protect. As the landscape blurred past him, Merlin's thoughts drifted back to Morgana. She had always been a thorn in Camelot's side, but these a broken bar. This was different. This was personal. She must have spent years searching for the pact, unraveling its mysteries, and now she was poised to use it against him, against Arthur, against all of Camelot. The wind whipped through his hair as he rode, and the distant mountains loomed on the horizon. The grove was just beyond them, hidden in a valley that time seemed to have forgotten. Merlin had stumbled upon it by chance all those years ago, drawn by the whispers of ancient magic. And now, he was returning to face the consequences of his actions. The sun was high in the sky when he finally reached the edge of the grove. The trees here were ancient, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. The air was thick with magic, the same magic that had lured him here so many years ago. Merlin dismounted and walked slowly toward the center of the grove. The stones were still there, arranged in a perfect circle, each one etched with the same sigils that had appeared in his vision. The air hummed with power, and Merlin could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. He stepped into the circle, his heart pounding. The ground beneath his feet felt alive with energy, pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. He knelt and placed his hands on the stones, closing his eyes and reaching out with his magic. For a moment, nothing happened. The grove was silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind. And then, a voice, soft at first, but growing louder, spoke from the shadows. Merlin. He opened his eyes and turned, his heart skipping a beat. Standing at the edge of the grove was the guardian of the pact, a figure cloaked in shadow and light, its form shifting like the air around it. Its eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, were fixed on him. "You have returned," the guardian said, its voice echoing in the air around them. Merlin swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I have no choice," he replied. "The pact a broken bar, it's been awakened." Morgana. The guardian raised a hand, silencing him. "The pact cannot be undone by mere words, Merlin. You know this." "I do," Merlin said, his voice steady. "But there must be a way." The guardian stepped forward, its presence filling the grove with a palpable energy. "There is always a way, but it comes with a price." Merlin felt a chill run down his spine. He had known this moment would come, but hearing the words aloud made it all the more real. "What price?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The guardian's eyes glowed brighter. "The bond is tied to your magic, Merlin. To break it, you must sever that connection. You must give up your power." Merlin's heart sank. His magic was more than just a tool, it was a part of him, woven into his very being. Giving it up would mean losing a part of himself, a part that had defined him for as long as he could remember. "Is there no other way?" he asked, his voice filled with desperation. The guardian shook its head. "The pact is powerful, bound by forces beyond your comprehension. To break it, you must be willing to sacrifice that which you hold most dear." Merlin closed his eyes, his mind racing. Could he really do it? Could he give up his magic to save Camelot? To stop Morgana? The answer was clear. There was no choice. He opened his eyes and met the guardian's gaze. "I'll do it." The guardian nodded, its form shifting once again. Then prepare yourself, Merlin. The process will not be easy, nor will it be painless. Merlin took a deep breath and stood tall. I'm ready. The guardian raised its hands, and the air around them crackled with energy. The sigils on the stones began to glow, and the ground beneath Merlin's feet trembled. He could feel the magic inside him stirring, resisting, but he held firm. This was his penance, his burden to bear. Merlin's body felt like it was being torn apart from the inside as the magic inside him resisted the guardian's pull. The power that had flowed through him for so many years now fought to remain, clinging to every fiber of his being. The air around him crackled with energy, the sigils on the stones glowing brighter with each passing second. He gritted his teeth, trying to focus, but the pain was overwhelming. His vision blurred as the magical force twisted and writhed inside him, refusing to be severed. It was as though his very soul was being split in two. You must remain still, Merlin, the guardian's voice echoed in the grove, calm and unyielding. If you resist, the process will only bring more pain. Merlin wanted to scream, to collapse under the weight of the agony that surged through his veins, but he stood firm. His entire life had been spent mastering magic, relying on it not only as a tool but as an extension of himself. Now, he was letting it slip away. A sudden pulse of energy shot through him, and he cried out, dropping to his knees as the power was torn from his grasp. His vision dimmed, and he felt the magic unraveling, like threads of light being pulled from his core. The guardian watched him in silence, its form shifting and pulsing with the magic it was drawing out. Merlin could feel his strength waning, the once mighty power inside him fading into a dull echo. The world around him seemed to grow quieter, as if the very magic of the earth no longer responded to his call. He gasped for air, collapsing forward onto the cold, hard ground. His fingers dug into the dirt as he fought to stay conscious, his body trembling with the effort. The magic was nearly gone now, just a faint whisper where there had once been a roaring storm. And then, in a single moment, it was over. The grove fell silent. The sigils dimmed and the pulsing energy faded into nothing. Merlin lay there, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The power that had been with him for so long, his constant companion, now was gone. He was no longer the Merlin of legend, no longer the most powerful sorcerer in the realm. He was just a man. The guardian stepped back, its form still shifting, its presence still vast. The pact has been broken, it said, its voice as distant as the stars. You have paid the price. Merlin slowly pushed himself up to his knees, his body aching with the effort. He felt hollow, as though a part of him had been ripped away, leaving only an empty shell. He looked down at his hands, now trembling and weak. For the first time in his life, there was no magic in his veins. But he was alive. And Camelot was Saphia for now. Go, the guardian said, turning away. Your task is not yet finished. Merlin nodded weakly and staggered to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he forced himself to stand tall. He had made his sacrifice, but Morgana's plan still loomed over Camelot like a shadow. And even without his magic, he would find a way to stop her. The journey back to Camelot was slow and grueling. The path that had once been so familiar now felt strange, like walking through a dream where the rules of reality were just out of reach. The world around him seemed muted without the hum of magic he had always known. Every step was a reminder of what he had lost, and yet he pressed on. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the towers of Camelot came into view. But even from a distance, Merlin could sense that something was wrong. Dark clouds swirled above the castle, unnatural and foreboding, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the air. Morgana was already making her move. Merlin urged his horse forward, though every part of him ached with exhaustion. He needed to get to Arthur before it was too late. When he reached the gates of Camelot, the guards barely glanced at him. There was fear in their eyes, and their attention was focused on the storm gathering above. Merlin dismounted and made his way toward the great hall, his legs shaking beneath him. Each step is harder than the last, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was tense. Servants rushed through the halls, their faces pale with worry. Merlin made his way toward the throne room, where he knew Arthur would be preparing for whatever disaster was about to strike. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. Arthur stood at the center of the room, his sword in hand, his face set in grim determination. Around him, the knights of Camelot were gathered, their armor gleaming even in the dim light of the hall. But the tension in the air was palpable, and Merlin could see the worry etched on Arthur's face. "Merlin," Arthur said, turning to face him. His eyes widened as he took in Merlin's haggard appearance. "What happened to you?" Merlin took a deep breath, steadying himself. "The pact is broken," he said, his voice hoarse. "But Morgana broken bar, she's using its power." "She's here, Arthur." Arthur's grip on his sword tightened, and he nodded. "We've been preparing for her attack. The storms began just after sunrise, and the castle's defenses are failing." Merlin closed his eyes for a moment, trying to summon the strength he no longer had. Without his magic, he couldn't protect Camelot the way he once had. But there had to be another way. "She's stronger now," Merlin said quietly. "Stronger than we've ever faced. But she's tied to the pact, just as I was. Without the pact's magic, she'll be weakened. If we can force her to break her connection to Ida." Arthur stepped forward, his face set with resolve. "Then we stop her." Merlin nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. He had always faced Morgana with the full force of his magic, but now he was just a man. And yet, even without his power, he had to believe that he could still make a difference. "Where is she?" Arthur asked, his voice steady. Merlin's gaze drifted toward the window, where the dark clouds churned and lightning flashed in the distance. "She's here, in Camelot." "She's already begun her final move." Arthur's jaw clenched, and he motioned to the knights. "Prepare yourselves. We face Morgana tonight." The knights nodded in unison, their expressions grim but determined. Merlin stood beside Arthur as they made their way out of the great hall and toward the battlements. The wind howled through the stone corridors, and the sky above seemed to pulse with energy as the storm grew more intense. When they reached the top of the battlements, the scene that greeted them was nothing short of apocalyptic. Dark clouds swirled in the sky, forming a vortex above the city. Lightning flashed, illuminating the castle walls, and the wind tore through the streets with a ferocity that sent shivers down Merlin's spine. And at the center of it all, standing atop the highest tower of Camelot, was Morgana. She was a vision of darkness, her robes billowing in the wind, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Her hands were raised toward the sky, and from her fingertips, tendrils of dark magic snaked outward, feeding into the storm above. "Morgana!" Arthur shouted, his voice carrying over the howling wind. Morgana turned slowly, her gaze locking onto Arthur and Merlin. A wicked smile spread across her face, and she lowered her hands, though the storm continued to rage around her. "Arthur," she called, her voice dripping with malice. "You're too late. Camelot will fall tonight, and there's nothing you or Merlin can do to stop it." Arthur's grip on his sword tightened, and he stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Morgana. "This is your last chance, Morgana. Surrender now, or face the consequences." Morgana laughed, the sound echoing through the storm. "Consequences? You think you can stop me? You have no idea what power I've gained." Merlin stepped forward, his heart pounding. "You're wrong, Morgana. The pact you've tied yourself to, it's broken." For a moment, something flickered in Morgana's eyes, a flash of uncertainty. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, and she smiled again, her expression dark and triumphant. "You think that matters, Merlin?" she hissed. "I've already drawn its power. Camelot will crumble, and you will all bow before me." Arthur raised his sword, ready to charge, but Merlin grabbed his arm, holding him back. There was another why there had to be. "Morgana," Merlin said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "The pact may have given you power, but it has also bound you. You're tied to it now, just as I was. If you continue to draw from it, it will destroy you." Morgana's smile faltered, and for the first time, Merlin saw a flicker of doubt cross her face. "You're lying," she spat, but there was an edge of uncertainty in her voice. Merlin took a step forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Am I?" "You've felt it, haven't you? The strain, the pull of the magic. It's tearing you apart from the inside." For a moment, Morgana hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if she was considering his words. But then, with a scream of rage, she raised her hands, summoning a blast of dark magic that shot toward Merlin. Arthur lunged forward, raising his shield, and the blast struck it with a deafening crash. The force of the impact sent them both staggering backward, but Arthur held firm, protecting Merlin from the worst of the attack. "Enough!" Arthur shouted, stepping in front of Merlin. "Morgana, this ends now." Merlin, his heart pounding in his chest, watched as Arthur charged forward, his sword gleaming in the lightning-lit darkness. Morgana unleashed another wave of dark magic, but Arthur dodged it, his movements quick and precise. He closed the distance between them, his sword raised high, and with a single, powerful strike, he knocked Morgana's staff from her hands. Morgana screamed in fury, her eyes wild with rage as Arthur pressed his attack. But even as he fought, Merlin could see that Morgana was weakening. The magic she had drawn from the pact was unstable, tearing her apart just as he had warned. "Arthur!" Merlin called, his voice strained. "The pact, it's breaking her." Arthur didn't hesitate. He raised his sword one last time, and with a powerful strike, he shattered the remains of Morgana's connection to the pact. The dark magic around her faltered, and Morgana let out a final, anguished scream as the storm above them began to dissipate. Merlin watched in silence as the clouds cleared, and the first rays of dawn broke through the sky. Morgana lay motionless on the tower, her power broken, her reign of terror finally ended. Arthur sheathed his sword, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. He turned to Merlin, his expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "It's over," Arthur said quietly. Merlin nodded, though the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his chest. The cost had been great. His magic was gone, Morgana was defeated, but Camelot was Saphia for now. As the sun rose over the kingdom, Merlin looked out over the city, knowing that his role in Camelot's future had changed forever. He was no longer the most powerful sorcerer, but he had found something far more important. He had found redemption,